It's now a few minutes past the hour, so let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Joe Miller, and I'm the Learning Strategy Manager here at Alteryx. Today, we're hoping to get you up and going on dynamic inputs. Dynamic inputs are a great way of productionalizing your processes or just making things a little bit quicker so you don't have to keep dragging your input tools in, whether it be for multiple sheets with an Excel file or multiple CSVs or even for SQL queries. So we'll run through a few of those cases. Now, due to the nature of today's session, I've uploaded only one of the workflows to Community so people could view it. So if you go to the training section and into live training, and then go to the actual training that we have today, likely you entered through this page to get to this meeting here today, you'll see that I've uploaded a starting workflow and a completed workflow. And as a note, there is a cast tool inside of there, so the workflow itself might not even work for those trying to open it. But if you do go to the Dynamic Inputs page, you'll see that we do have the attachments down here for your review. And as always, I am recording the session, so you can hear back at the end or review this. If you say, hey, I remember Joe talked about this, but I didn't need it at the time, you can absolutely go back here, and we'll have a playback that you can watch at your own convenience. So what we're going to do today is go over some of the upcoming trainings. Very, very light workflow background this week. I think it's going to benefit us a little bit more to actually get our hands in some of these dynamic cases. And there's 3 or 4 ways that we're going to demonstrate today to dynamically bring in your data. We're going to jump into that designer and build them out for you, and then just cover off on some support items. Just as a FYI, we have 2 more trainings coming up through May. So we have one starting on the 16th, which is really getting started with batch reporting. What we'll do is we'll build out a simple report and then teach you how to batch it. Secondly, we have the running totals and weighted averages class. It ran once last year, so it's a bit of a rarity if you come around to it, but if you're new to something like weighted averages, it's a good class to get acquainted with that tool. So beyond that, at the end of May, we're actually preparing for Alteryx Inspire, which runs June 5th through June 7th. And there we run 3 days of classroom training. There's tech tracks. There's customers that are talking about how they're using Alteryx. If you haven't signed up for Alteryx Inspire, it's a really great opportunity, and it'll be hosted in Las Vegas this year. We provide all access to training for a $500 fee on top of whatever the conference fee would be. But it's really great because you can just really attend any sessions that you want there. I would caution you, though, that sessions are filling up fast. So if you are interested in really deep diving for 3 days into some training content, definitely look towards Inspire, because it's one of the times that we rarely get into the classrooms and really do that hands-on training opportunity. Okay, so use cases. Why do I care about dynamic inputs? Many of you probably already know why you care today by the mere fact that you've showed up to this training. But just to name a few, right, we have input data tools littering our canvas. So I've shown up and seen customers connecting to 30 different sheets within a workbook and had 30 different inputs. And I would just mention, hey, this is easily accomplished with 2 tools. So really cutting down on that amount of work of connecting and doing a lot of that monotonous setting up these connections. Manual work to connect to a desired range of data. And when we think of this, I'm typically thinking of some sort of database instance. So let's say we had a workflow where we always wanted to run 1 year's worth of data from today. Right? So today is 5/9/2017. What if I wanted data all the way back to 5/9/2016 and then run some sort of analysis on that? For many people who are not working with that data dynamically, they're punching in a new date every time they go into a workflow. We're going to show an example here, which you will likely not be able to follow along unless you have an example set up in your InDB instance, where you can dynamically change your SQL query so you can pull the data that you desire without ever having to change it if you have some sort of rule like capture the past year or the past two weeks or whatnot. So those are the many different things that we go into. So Instead of manually updating and adding inputs to Designer, we're just going to try to connect through a single source. And I'll show you some of the different ways that we can do that here today. So this is the one workflow that I did post into the actual live training post inside community. Feel free to review. Now, many of you might show up and see that this tool is missing. That's just because you don't have one of the requisite data packages to run it. So if you don't see that there, don't worry. All that tool really does is it's just really geocoding based on addresses. So it's dropping a coordinate onto our map, a single spatial point to say where that store is. So we'll be using that today, and we're going to be building out a workflow that essentially brings in a number of customer stores, finding their location, and then we have an Excel workbook of all the store locations and all the store competitors with a number of tabs within them, and bringing them all in with a single go instead of adding many, many different inputs. So let's go ahead and jump into the Designer. If you do have any questions throughout this training, feel free to add them into the Q&A. I do have the Q&A open in my other window, so I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability at the time, or I may follow up with them at the end of the session. So let's go ahead and open up a new workflow, and I'm going to connect to some data for the first time. So let me move some of my windows around on my other screen here. All right. So the first one that we're going to connect to is something called customer stores. And if you're opening our starting file, these should already be zipped in for you. And I did version them back to 10.0, so those should be compatible with everybody's. Okay, so customer stores. In this one, it's very straightforward, an Excel workbook with only one sheet. So we're just going to select OK and read in that sheet and review it. So you can see that I just have a few store IDs here, just a handful of them, and I want to compare them to my competitors here. So I can run to make sure that connects OK. And let's go ahead and connect to my other file here. So I'm going to go ahead and go to File and select Store Locations. Now what I see many people do is go in here and say, oh, I really want all of these, right? Here's one location, a second location, third, fourth, all of these locations, right? I want them all. What they'll do is they'll just go ahead and select one for city, select one for FedEx location, and they'll keep copying and pasting that same thing and just changing the table that it's connecting to. Okay, so you can see when you have really big workbooks how this could really add up very, very quickly. So what we want to do is streamline our process in this case to dynamically bring in everything that's contained within that workbook. I really want to be able to pull these all into one table. So if you're curious on what that workbook looks like, let me quickly show you outside of that just so you can see it a little bit better here. Here we go. So you can see we have multiple tabs. We can really pull only one at a time with the input data tool. However, with the pairing of the input data tool and something we'd like to call the dynamic input tool, we can create some sort of rule to bring these all in at once. And one of the things that I'm really going to stress the importance of is this concept called schema. For many people who are really familiar with data concepts might know what schema is, but really what we're talking about is the structure of these files. You can see that I have a number of fields. We can say A through I, right? We have I number of fields, and they're named company, store type, address, city, state. That's really schema. How many are there and what are they named, as an example. And you can see if I toggle through each of them, all the schemas match between them, right? Which is really, really critical when we start talking about dynamically importing. The reason that I mention this is that if you want to bring everything into the same table or same poll, we have to make sure that everything matches up between these files. If we have one file that's just talking about state taxes and the other about customer sales, two very different looking types of data sources, they likely won't mesh together very well because they're two conceptually very different things. When you think of these dynamic inputs, think of like, how many times do I have this file, right? It could be based on a tab for every store. It could be for a time period. It could just be a duplication of that same information across some sort of dimension. So when you look at these files, I'm really going to stress the importance of making sure that your schema is matching between them, or else Alteryx Designer will have to go through some logic to try to match them up, and I'll address that momentarily. So let's go ahead and find a way that we can connect to all of these tabs at one time. Now, when working with Excel files, I'm sure many of you know this, but I'll make that mention. Make sure that your Excel file is closed, or else you will automatically fail because it's locked. And let's open our Designer up again. Okay. So there's an option in here that many of you may not have noticed if you've been working with your Excel files, is if you go down here and go back to your table or query setting. Right now we're just connecting to the table called city. Let's go ahead and go to something called list of sheet names. And all this will do is it will query your workbook and ask you, hey, what are all the names of the sheets? And essentially we'll just give you this list back as a result. So I'm going to select that and run, and you can see that I just have a list of sheet names. So it's behaving exactly as I'd like it to. Okay. Now there's no other configuration settings that I want, so I'm going to jump in and go into my next tool. So really, by doing this type of query, connecting to just a list of sheet names, I'm setting myself up with a list of what I want to read in. So for example, if I wanted to exclude some sort of sheets from my future dynamic input, say I don't want anything that contained the word target in it, now would be the time to filter out the sheets that you want. So I'll say it does not contain target as an example. So if you wanted to exclude anything that you're about to read in, now is the time to do it. And you can manipulate that before we bring in our dynamic input tool. In this case, I'm interested in just doing everything. I just want to pull it all in at once. So I'm going to delete this and pull in my dynamic input tool. This is a really powerful tool. And for many of you looking at this tool for the first time, it can be a little bit confusing. Okay, so let's take a moment to look at what this configuration has to offer. So you'll see at the very top, I have something called Input Data Source Template. Okay, and this is where we come back to talking about schema. Okay, I need to tell my Alteryx Designer what schema I would expect. In our case, I saw that I wanted the fields A through I, and I wanted them to be named some sort of way, right? So I'm just going to pull open a notepad, and we'll just make a crude schema note. So let's say I've got 3 different sources. I'll call this source 1, source 2, and source 3. Okay, and let's say the field names inside of this one was first name, go back here. Let's say it was first name, last name. This one had field names of first name, last name, but separated by an underscore. And let's say my third one had the same as the first name, last name. So to us, all these 3 sources are really identical, right? They mean the same thing to us. All 3 sources have a field that reflects a first name value and a last name value. However, the schemas don't exactly match. While they are logically the same, there's one schema in here that's kind of misnamed, right? It's got an underscore in between that. So how do we want to have these arranged, right? The easiest way that Alteryx is going to read them in is going to say, hey, everything that matches this name, read them all in. Okay, so we get to specify which file we want to follow, right? What do we want the resulting data set to be going forward as? Do we want the resulting data set coming out of that dynamic input to be named with underscores or no underscores, right? And this is where the template comes in. I'm saying, should I follow source 1 as my template, source 2, source 3? What do I want to have designer try to match on? So the big question that many people ask me now is, how does Alteryx match on these, right? I can specify what I want it to match on, but how does it actually behave? Okay. So in the ideal world, if I were to set source 1 as my template, if it was matching only on name, the only other source that would match is source 3. So it would only bring in source 1 and source 3 into my designer. However, there is some embedded logic within designer to say, hey, if there's also the same amount of fields within the directory or the location you may be looking at, also import that with a warning, that is being the big one. So technically, by naming source 1 as my template, it would go through and say, well, this fails because the naming is not the same. However, it does match in the number of columns. So it's going to import source 2. Okay? And it will import source 3 on the mere fact that it matches on name. Okay? So there is some logic there, and it is a cautionary tale because there is some sort of logic in here that could cause your data to get a little messed up. So let's say this file had won't control Z, but let's say you had last name, first name with an underscore. If they were named the same as the other ones, it would remap them based on name. But if it goes into that positional logic of saying, does it have the same number of columns, then it's just going to essentially union them in by position. So luckily, I'm in this fortunate situation where my input data for this store locations Excel file, everything matches across the board, or so I believe. So let's choose a template. I'm going to go to my store locations. I can choose which one I want to follow. In this case, it's tomato, tomato, because everything's named exactly the same. So I'm going to select OK, and we've set this template. Now, this workflow will not run without a template. It is a requirement in order to run it. So we've connected to this workbook, but we need to choose what sheets we read in. So we have this field conveniently with this list of sheet names, and we're saying, hey, read a list of this data sources from this file. So we want to read in all those sheet names, and it's going to go through and basically create a bunch of, you won't see it, but behave just like multiple inputs, going through and pulling in city, a full data set of city first, and then full data set of FedEx pickup location, then Sam's Club, and we'll compile one large data set. And there's an action down here called change in file name or table name. We'll just leave that as is, since when we talk about sheets, it's really kind of the table within the workbook. So we're saying, hey, for each iteration that you run through store locations, run it first for store locations, table name of city, right? We change the file or table name. And the next iteration, go through store locations, FedEx pickup location, so on and so forth. There are some other options here, which you can think of being broader than just Excel sheets. So if we were looking inside a directory and wanted to change the path, right, or the file name, you could use that change file or change entire file path as options to dynamically input that data. So let's go ahead and run that and see how we did. Now immediately you may have noticed down here at the very bottom inside my results pane, if I go to my log, you can see exactly what happened, right? I can see that, looks like I accidentally opened it there. You can see that I brought in store locations for city, store locations for FedEx, Sam's, Target Express, Walmart, so on and so forth. If there was something that was misaligned by name or there was a missing field, you would see it here. Everything just happens to mesh very well in this case. So I'm going to pause there for a moment and see if there's any questions coming through our Q&A. Okay, so let's drag in a few tools here and just complete this workflow, and then I'll address a few more dynamic ways that you can bring it in. So in this case, we wanted to look at the actual locations for our geocoder. So I'm going to bring in my street geocoder tool, and again, if you don't see this, that's absolutely fine. That may be just the installation that you have. And really what I want to get out of this is a spatial object. So I'm just going to go in and get a spatial object out of this. I'll add a browse tool so we can view what that's actually doing. And you can see I'm rendering a map of all my locations in the Denver area. Now the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to geocode this bottom data set for my store locations as well. Luckily, this one only had addresses to work off of and not longitude and latitude. However, this data set does have longitude and latitude, so I can just use our create points tool. So I'm going to drop that in and let it run. Okay, so now each of my data sets have a spatial point, and now I can do my find nearest. Okay, so let's find our nearest competitors here. I'm going to drag this one into the match, this one into the target. As a best practice, whenever you're doing find nearest, whatever you have more points in or more spatial area, put it into the target and put the least into the universe. Because certainly you could revert these, but it's a really nice way to speed up your spatial tool. So we're going to choose our centroid and our spatial object. We'll use a find nearest point of 1 and maximum distance of 20. That's absolutely fine. And I'll add a browse tool to that. And now for each location, I have our nearest store. Okay. So that's perfect. We could do a few more things, but that's really what I wanted to do for this file, is quickly show you how I was able to bring in all of these store locations spread across multiple sheets and be able to find the nearest on. And certainly you could go on and do further analysis past this. So let's open a new workflow here and go into another use case that many people go into, right? And that's, let's say people are getting into some sort of situation where they have files dropped into a network path every day, right? And the files run daily. They just land there and they need some sort of analysis. We have some tools that allow us to complete some sort of logic to import those into Designer dynamically. So if you go to your in and out palette, there's a tool in here called directory tool. So I'm just going to find something to demonstrate here. I'll go to my desktop, see if I can find the right one that I'm looking for. Let's collapse this. There we go. This is the one I'm looking for. So I have something called SF data. Really, it's representing the yearly data of San Francisco, but you could imagine it as something that might be a daily process. So I'm going to go ahead and run that and show you what the result of this tool is. This tool will read back all the information that you'd have within your Windows Explorer, right? What the path is to get to this directory, what the directory was, what are the files inside there. So you can see I have 3 CSV files called San Francisco 2011, San Francisco 2012, San Francisco 2013. The short file names, what the creation time of those files were, the last write time. So you can see these two were absolutely identical, with this one being the latest. The size of those files. And you can complete all sorts of logic, right? I could put in a filter saying, remove any files bigger than this. But let's say I always want to bring in the latest and greatest file, right? How would I do that? Well, by using the directory tool, it becomes very easy. I can go in here and read in my directory and do something saying, hey, what was the last one that was written, right? So now I could sort on last write time and import that. So let's go in, and I'm going to drag in a sort tool here. And I'm going to go last write time, and sure, we'll go ascending. Okay. So you can see my last write time right here at the very bottom. They're nice and sorted. They're actually in the same order they were before because they were pre-sorted, but it's a good way of assuring that you have the one that you want. If I wanted to sort them the other way, I could just flip it to descending, so my latest is at top, which is a little bit easier to see. So now, let's say I only want to read in my latest one. I'm going to bring in a sample tool, knowing that they're in the order of the date, and just ask for the first record. Okay. So now I can see that that San Francisco 2013 is the only one that's being selected. And now I'm ready to read it in with the dynamic input tool. So I can choose my source again. We'll go back to my desktop here, choose the SF data, and I could choose any of these, knowing that they're in the same format. Select OK, and then choose a field, right? So how do I want to read these in this time? It's not an Excel file. It's just a straight CSV path. What I can do is just say, hey, use the full path to read in this file. So I'm going to go back over here and say use full path and change the entire file path. Go ahead and run. And now you can see that my data set has been read in. So this is San Francisco 2013 that's being read in right now. But if I were to leave and go back into San Francisco 2013, and let's pretend, we'll open this 2013 file here real quick. File, we'll save this one, San Francisco 2014. So now, when I go back into my designer and run this workflow again, I'm going to have 2014 with the latest write time, and it's going to be read in. So, oops, looks like there you go. I failed to heed my own warning. I have to make sure I close my document there. So now you can see my San Francisco 2014 CSV was run in. So you can see that same logic of me selecting the whole directory, finding the last file, taking the first one, and then dynamically taking that last one. The nice thing about this directory tool as well is that you could specify what you want to look at within that directory using these asterisks and stars. Okay. We also can use question marks, and I'll address that at this moment. Okay. Also do note that if there's subdirectories there, you could actually look at the data underneath those following subdirectories as well. So before I show the next dynamic way, I'm going to pause for a second and make sure there's no questions on using that directory tool. So we have a few questions coming in here. One says, I have a set of 52 Excel files with the same schema. The files are only different in the number of sheets they have per file, and then an example comes down. So some of the easiest ways when we talk about reading Excel files is either connecting to one workbook and reading in multiple sheets, or connecting to multiple workbooks and reading in the same sheet name. But when you start connecting to multiple workbooks and multiple sheet names, it becomes a little bit more complex, but it's pretty easily doable. And that's something that we can follow up on after this session. That's easily accomplished. So the question is, what if you have a lot of files inside the subdirectory? How do you speed up the query? I guess it's probably very negligible because when you're reading in this tool, you're just reading in the names. So even if you had a million files within there, Alteryx Designer would handle them very quickly. It only becomes when you're importing a million files. When you get to this point, that's when you really have to be careful. So if you want to get to a point where you want to speed up that query, make sure you're filtering out all the files that you don't want to bring in before you get to that dynamic input, or else you're going to be bringing in unnecessary data and just be large quantities to deal with later. But and purely in terms of searching this subdirectory, it shouldn't be very long at all. Okay, so there's a note saying that someone tried using the asterisk to call the file names, but not sure how to indicate the sheet name. So I'm going to introduce that one next, but it's going to be a little bit outside the scope of using it for bringing in Excel files. But it is important for bringing in something, let's say, like CSVs. So let's create a new file here very quickly. And I'm going to bring it into the canvas. And really what I want to do is, in that same San Francisco file that we just demoed over here, instead of always grabbing one, I just want to grab all of them at once. Excel files are different because there's multiple tables within one file, but if there's multiple files like CSV, then that's where I could really use something that we like to call wildcards. So if I were to open up the directory that contains my San Francisco data, you'll notice that everything has some sort of similarity between it, right? They have the same names, they have the same extension. The only thing that seems to vary is the date itself, the year. So how do I capture all of these with one input data tool and not using a dynamic input? Well, it's quite simple, and I think I'll bring up the notepad here just to explain the concept yet again. So let's say I have something called San Francisco 2011.csv, San Francisco 2012.csv, San Francisco 2013.csv. There are two types of wildcards that you can use inside of Alteryx. One being the asterisk, so any number of characters, and the other being a question mark, which is a single character. So what does this mean? So what if I wanted to create a file name that was flexible enough to cover all of these file names, right? So we know one thing that they have in common is they both start with San Francisco _ and then they have some series of numbers representing a year, and they're .csv. Okay? How do we represent that this middle portion here can be flexible to any sort of year? That's where wildcards come in. I'll say, hey, it could be any string of characters. So this asterisk could say, hey, if I put San Francisco _star.csv, it will bring anything with the prefix of San Francisco.csv into Designer. One caution is that something like San Francisco Joe.csv would work with that because it's any string of characters in between the prefix of San Francisco.csv. This means it could be any number of characters. You could improve this saying that knowing that it's going to be a year every time, I'd expect there to be 4 characters. So you could replace it with something like 4 question marks, saying, hey, it has to be 4 characters long. Certainly I could have my name like that be imported, but you're starting to restrict what that could be a little bit more. So when you're writing your sheets, using this style, one thing that I'd always recommend is looking at the log and making sure that you're importing the way that you'd expect, okay? And the rule that we run with, since we don't have a dynamic input, is whatever is actually brought in first becomes the template, right? So if San Francisco 2011 comes in, that's the go forward logic. Everything is going to inherit the name, the number of columns, everything's going to be matched against San Francisco 2011. So let's go back in here, and I'm going to connect to that San Francisco file. And by best practices, I always just select one of the files, and then I go into the file path and manually edit it. So I know that 2011 I will vary. So I'll say it's got to have 4 question marks. I'll run it in, and you do see that I get 2 warnings, right? San Francisco 2011 came in okay, 2012 came in okay, but 2013 is giving me a warning, right? 2013, it's saying, hey, just so you know, these fields have a little bit of a different name, but it does import. And oh, by the way, 2014 also has the same naming differences. Let's go ahead and look at those files really quick to observe if that's okay with us. So I'm going to open San Francisco 2011. So you can see everything in here has just really basic names, title case with a space inside of it. If we go to 2013, you can see everything is named the same, but it's not title case, it has underscores. But if we do observe between the two, we have employee name, job title, base pay, overtime. They have the same number of fields, and they're lined up in the same order that we want. So at the end of the day, I'm okay with these being imported with the different names. But as a result, when you look at the output, you'll see that, like I said, whatever that first file that came in, say San Francisco 2011, that got the go-ahead name. So employee name with a space, since it was in San Francisco 2011, that's why it shows up that way and not with an underscore. It becomes the template. So that's how you can work with multiple files at the same one. And you have that same functionality where you have the ability to go into subdirectories. So if you want to look deep and further into your machine for the similar type of files, you could select that and look through the subdirectories. So that's the third way that you can do this. And I see that I have a few questions here, so I'm going to pause for a second. Someone says that there's an amazing macro called the Excel file opener, and it is developed by Cameron Steele, who's a very gifted developer here inside of Alteryx. So I will share this with everybody. It's a reference to community. So if you want an easy way of something that's pre-built to do what some of the questions were earlier, you could go ahead and use this. So I'm going to send it to all attendees here via the chat so everybody can see that. I'll open it up very quickly. And certainly if you go on to gallery.alteryx.com, there may be a few other versions of this as well. So you can see how someone like Cameron is actually accomplishing this. Okay, time for our fourth way. So many ways. Time for our fourth way to dynamically bring in data. And this one is more for those who are working in the database environment. You may find different ways that you may want to apply this if you're outside of that, but I think the most common use case would be that. So let me connect to a file very quickly. Let's connect to my Microsoft SQL Server Express and go inside, and we'll just use this to look at the data that we have there. I have a transactional table, and inside of that transactional table, there's a series of dates, right? And when that transaction was carried out, what customer it was carried out by, so on and so forth. And let's say I just wanted to take a rolling year, right? Every time I want to take a workflow, I just want to grab the last year's worth of data to do analysis on. I want to make that process dynamic. How do we do that? So the first thing that we need to do is we really just need to determine what today's date is dynamically instead of having you plug it in personally. So let's go into our in-out tool, our in-out palette, and go to a tool called Date Time Now. And all this Date Time Now tool will do is kick out the current date time that reflects your system. Okay. In this case, I'm just going to select the Alteryx date, so the 4-digit year, 2-digit month, and 2-digit day. I'll go ahead and run that. And easy as that, I've just got an output saying what today's date is. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is convert this to, hold on one second. So I'm going to go ahead and create some sort of date calculation based off of this. So let's go ahead and calculate 1 year beyond what this date was. So I'm going to bring in a formula tool, and I'm going to create 2 fields, just clean it up a little bit. I'm going to rename the date time now field to start date. I'm going to convert it to the date format. And there, I'll just say whatever it's date time now. And you can see in the data preview, it seems to be working properly. I'm going to create another field called end date. Sorry, this should be my end date because I want a year past. So I'm going to call that my end date. And this should be my start date, which should be a year prior today. So I'm going to start adding in my formula, date time diff, or date time add. Okay, and using the date time add tool, I can add or subtract values from a year. So I'm going to say whatever the date time of now is, remove 1 year from it. Okay, so first parameter is the date. The second one was what number of units. It's represented by I want to add or subtract. And then the year. And I too will change this to be a date. So let's go ahead and run that and see how that looks. So I've got 2017-0509 and the start date of 2016-0509. So that's perfect. So now I want to go back and look at this table inside Microsoft SQL Server and grab just the transactions that have those dates or between those dates. So I'm going to use that dynamic input tool again. And I'm going to go in and choose my table first as my data source template. So I'm going to go to that SQL Server Express and say, hey, it should match that schema of the dynamic input training. That's really straightforward because we're essentially pulling from that table. We're just dynamically pulling dates from it. Okay? And let's say I want to create some additional logic within there, right? So I'm going to go back into this edit and say that we have some sort of logic in there that says we want to grab between these 2 dates, right? Really random 2 dates where the dynamic input training date is greater than 2004, 10, 12. It was hard-coded at one time, right? And really what I want to do is replace this greater than with my start date value and this end date with this ending value with my end date value. So I want this to become the 2016-0509, and I want this to become the 2017-0509. But I've built this query just to run by itself as is. So that's my template, okay? Now, the one thing that we worked on last time was this list of data sources. But I'm going to use this modify SQL query. So I want to replace 2 different strings inside of there. I want to replace what the begin date was and what the end date was. So I'm going to choose to replace a specific string. And here it'll give you your query that you're running right now. So let's go ahead and find what our start date was. I'm going to delete everything but that start date that was hard-coded into that SQL query. And what I want to replace it with is a start date. Okay, so now it should become 2016-0509. And then I'm going to add another one, and I want to replace my end value. So I'm going to highlight everything I don't want from there and replace it with my end date. So now I've got my template where I had my select where statement, and I'm replacing those 2 values of 2004 to be 2016 and 2017. So now when I look inside my canvas, you can see that I have everything all the way up to the day after. I could certainly update to be greater than or equal to, but it looks like it was just greater than that start date. So 5/10 was the first day, and it brought in every transaction between that day and 2017-0509. So we were dynamically able to grab those. And you can certainly change this along the way. You could have said, 1 month as an example. And it would bring in the last month of data. So that's a nice way of really dynamically bringing in your data through that workflow. So those are the big ways that you can use it. Just as a recap, you have the option to just use the input data tool and use your knowledge of asterisks. However, that is working more with directory-driven files. If you're working with Excel or you want to read in multiple sheets, the dynamic input tool is ideal. And if you're working in multiple paths, it's also ideal. The directory tool is a good way of querying to see what files you have available and present some sort of logic to filter out those files before you read them in. And then this dynamic select, again, is also important when you get to when you're trying to pull via SQL, right, based on a dynamic range. So those are some of the interesting ways that you could accomplish some dynamic tasks. And there's many, many, many more. If you have a specific use case, you could always use the Alteryx community because more likely than not, someone has already done what you've been trying to do. So some support items. If you want to review this training today, go to community.alteryx.com. I will be uploading this at the end of the day for your review. So if I was clipping along pretty quickly, I want to make sure that I explained as many ways as possible today. But if you want to go back and review one particular way, you can go there. We also have started to integrate our training into community.alteryx.com. We have some weekly challenges there. So if you'd like to put what you practice into action, you could go ahead and do that. Technical support. So if you have any issues that you want help with, please contact us at support@alteryx.com. After this webinar completes, you will be redirected to a survey. It's a great way of upvoting what we do in the future and what you want to learn about. Additionally, it helps us understand what was effective for you, what was not, and take any of your comments, and we take them to heart so we can improve our training in the future. So thank you for joining today. I'm going to hang on for a little bit longer to answer any other questions. And if you are good, we'll see you next week. Thank you.